Jai Jinendra, Om Haram everyone. My name is Rajiv Shah, and on behalf of JVB London, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all for Professor Gary Francoine's inspirational and thought-provoking talk on Jainism, relativism, and the moral imperative of Ahimsa. To introduce Gary is indeed a challenge with his vast accolades and achievements. He is an American scholar and philosopher and holds the highest rank of being the Distinguished Professor of Law at Rutgers University and visiting professor at University of Lincoln and University of East Anglia in the UK. In his search for deeper meaning of life, Gary came across Jainism. His faith and admiration for this pristine philosophy has made him an passionate advocate and ambassador for the Jain philosophy. Moreover, Gary is an icon in the realm of animal rights and has been a staunch vegan for over 40 years, long before many of us even knew what veganism was. Before I request Gary to enlighten us with his profound and insightful talk, I wish to actually extend my heartiest birthday greetings to him, which he celebrated yesterday, Gary. I'm sure let's all join together and wish Gary a very happy birthday from everyone who's joined into this talk. Om Aram, Gary. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the birthday greetings. I don't like to think about my birthday anymore because they're just, the number is getting way too high. In any event, let me see if I can share the screen. I want to thank Dr. Samani Pratibha Pragyaji and Samani Swarn Pragyaji for inviting me, and Rajiv Shah, who has put this all together. I also want to thank the Jain Vishwa Bharati of North America in Iceland, New Jersey. And I want to thank Samani Murit Pragya, who is now Sadhvi Mimamsa Prabha, and Samani Shukla Pragya, who is now Sadhvi Samta Prabha. And they taught me Preakshaw meditation. As a matter of fact, Rajiv, are they still able to see me on the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, over here, you can see this is my certificate for Preakshaw meditation. I was trained as a Preakshaw meditation person, and I was trained in Preakshaw meditation. And over here, you have this is the Navakar mantra with all of the with Acharya Sri Mahapragya, Tulsi, and Maharashtra. So they're all there. Anyway, and I also want to thank Samani Chaitanya Pragya, who is a Samaniji at Florida International University. She's encouraged me a lot in this research that I'm doing on Anekantavada. And I want to acknowledge two people who I think are with us this morning, Dr. Sulak Jain and Dr. Jaswant Modi, with whom I'm working. We've been colleagues for a long time, but we're working together on trying to bring Jainism more into North America and into North American universities. And I want to thank and acknowledge them. The centerpiece of the Jain doctrine of relativism is Anekantavada. This is something we hear about all the time. Anekantavada is the doctrine of Jain relativism. Now, I want to give you a different view of this today because I think it's very important. I think that we are misinterpreting what Anekantavada means. Anekantavada is an ontological or metaphysical doctrine. It is ontological because it concerns what is. And it's metaphysical because it is about the nature of what is. It claims that reality is irreducibly complex. The world around us is irreducibly complex. All of the substances in the world are irreducibly complex. Each has innumerable characteristics, qualities, modes, relations, facets, aspects. All right. And so we have this reality, and the reality is just incredibly complex with innumerable characteristics. Because reality is complex, those of us who are not Keval Gyan cannot have pramana or full knowledge of reality. Those of us who are not omniscient, which is basically all of us, right? Unless we have a secret Tirthankara amongst us this morning, nobody has Keval Gyan. Nobody has pramana or full knowledge of reality. We can only know things from a particular point of view, or naya, The particular point of view is what is called a Naya. So the system of describing reality from these different perspectives and points of view is Nayavada, okay? And because reality in the non-pramana sense, in the irreducibly complex sense, can only be understood from these Nayas, we can't make categorical propositions. We can't make absolute propositions because all things can only be understood from the particular Nayas. So sentences containing propositions about reality have to have in some sense appended. This reflects the Naya, and the expression is called sayadvad. Okay, so reality is irreducibly complex. It can't be understood in its full form in the pramana sense. It can only be understood from a particular perspective of point of view, from a Naya. This is called Nayabad. And when we use language to discuss the various Nayas that we're talking about, we have to always qualify the proposition with the expression in some sense, because we can only talk about the individual Naya that we're focused on at a particular time. So we have Anekantavada that tells us that reality is irreducibly complex. Nayadvad, which tells us that for all who are not keval gyan or omniscient, reality must be understood from different Nayas. And Sayadvad, which tells us that we cannot talk about reality in a categorical way. We have to qualify everything so that the Naya is reflected. Are you with me so far? Does anybody have any questions? Are we clear on this? All right. Now, the Jain theory of relativism, which I've just described, is very different from the theory of relativism as that is understood in Western philosophy. In the West, when we talk about relativism, what we mean is that knowledge, truth, or morality exist in relation to a culture or a society or a historical context. There is no absolute truth. So, for example, when we talk about slavery, human slavery, which we've had in the United States, and it still remains a problem. Slavery still remains a problem because of its legacy. People will say, well, in 1823, slavery was all right morally because it hadn't been outlawed then, so that you couldn't say that it was immoral because in 1862 a lot of people thought in that historical context that it was morally all right, and so that's a relative position, so that the morality of slavery exists in relation to a historical context. Now, I don't believe that. I'm not a moral relativist. I'm a moral realist. But that's what we talk about moral relativism in the West. We're not talking generally about substances. We're talking about, which is what Jain Dharma talks about when it talks about Anekantavada or relativism. It is referring to something that is about substances, about the fact that we can't know reality. We can only know it from perspectives, the Nayas, and we can only speak about it in particular ways, the Sayads, okay? But when we talk about relativism in the West, we're talking about a very, very different doctrine. We're saying, well, there's no truth. There's no truth. There is no absolute truth. It's a matter of culture. It's a matter of society. It's a matter of historical context. Jain relativism maintains that there is an absolute material reality that is independent of context, culture, or anything else. There is a truth about reality. But because we're not keval gyan, we can't know it in the pramana sense. Truth is relative to the Naya, and we have to express the Naya in sayadvad. Now, let's look at, so this is very different. One is a doctrine of morality and truth and whatnot. One is a doctrine about substance. The Jain doctrine of relativism is a doctrine about substance. It is not a doctrine about culture, about truth, about morality. We're going to get to that in a second. I want to explain how we got the doctrine of Anekantavada historically. The historical basis of Nayavada is that it was the middle path. You see, the Buddhists took the position that there was no reality, that there was no permanence in reality. Everything was in a constant state of flux. So there was what we call radical impermanence. And then you have the Hindus, on the other hand, who thought that there was only one reality, that there was a unitary permanence. So you had unitary permanence of the Hindus, radical impermanence of the Buddhists. The Jain position was the middle path that said that reality was both permanent and impermanent. There were substances, but the substances were in a constant state of flood, and the substances were permanent. So they partook of the Hindu notion of permanence. The substances were permanent, but the qualities and the modes were always changing. So the qualities and the modes reflected the Buddhist idea of radical impermanence, but there was both permanence and impermanence. Okay, so this was the genius of the Jain doctrine, because it said, well, the Buddhists are right in one sense and the Hindus are right in one sense, but we've got a different take on what reality is. All right, but it's important to understand that Nayadvad is about substances. It's about what's in the world, the Jiv, the Pudgal, the Dharma, the Adharma, the Akasa, and the Kala. It's about souls, it's about matter, it's about motion, it's about rest, it's about space, it's about times, and the modes of those substances. So Anekantavada is about substances, okay? It's about substances. It's not about morality. It's about substances. There are 7 Nayas that can be understood to reflect Dravya Nayas and Pariyaya Nayas. They concern the inherent qualities or particular modifications of Dravya, substance. We can't make absolute statements about substances because substances are permanent in one sense and impermanent in another. The problem is the doctrine of Anekantavada has now been used to make claims about Jainism supporting religious pluralism and moral pluralism. So in other words, Anekantavada in the past, I would say, from what I can tell from the literature, this started largely in the 1930s and 40s. People started talking about Anekantavada as moral relativism and Jainism as supporting religious pluralism and moral pluralism. I think that's wrong. This is problematic for 2 reasons. Anekantavada, Nayadvad, and Saidvad are about substances, about souls, about Atma, about Dharma, Adharma. It's about the substances. It's not about morality. It's not about religion. It's about substances. And to the extent that you start applying Anekantavada in the way that Anekantavada is now currently applied, it turns Jainism into a doctrine of relativism, which denies absolute truth. Now, religion, to the extent that Christianity and Jainism are describing the same reality when they discuss vitaraga, the state of being in equanimity. If you want to say, well, vitaraga and the sort of love that Christ talked about, Christian love, you could say, well, vitaraga, no animosity, no amity towards all beings, that is consistent with, that's what Jesus was talking about when Jesus talked about love. He obviously wasn't talking about passionate love. He was talking about something else. And so one could argue that, well, what Jesus was talking about was largely the same thing that the Jains talk about when they talk about vitaraga, the idea of no resentment, no enmity towards others, a complete state of amity. And that's what Jesus was talking about. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. Because in a sense, what we're talking about is the soul. We're talking about that from the standpoint of both Jain Dharma and Christianity. We're talking about the Atma or soul. They're different concepts, obviously, but they're similar. And so we're talking about when the soul is in a state of vitaraga or equanimity, or when the soul is in a state of love, of Christian love, we can say, well, they're in the same, this is describing the same state. But to the extent that Christianity maintains that love is what is commanded by a creator God, I mean, Christianity maintains that the universe was created by God. You can't reconcile that. You can't reconcile that with Jainism, which denies the existence of a creator God and which maintains that vitaraga is what is required for liberation. It's not a matter of what God wants, because there is no creator God. It's a matter of the physics of jiva and ajiva and the involvement of karma, the influx of karma, the release of karma. Okay, so do you understand? Does anybody, is this being clear? I mean, I want to be clear about this. That is everybody happy with this? If there's any questions, interrupt me and ask me now, because I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions? You are able to unmute. Have you unmuted your roles? If any questions, please do ask now. No, seems to be clear, Gary. You're unmute, Gary.
It's either clear or I've confused everybody so much they don't know what to ask. Let's hope that that's not the case. All right, so I mean, I was raised a Catholic. These ideas, Jain ideas, are in many ways, when I encountered them for the first time many decades ago, they were very strange to me, because, you know, the Christianity, particularly Catholicism, which is a particular sort of Christianity, but Christianity maintains that I should love because that's what God wants me to do. Whether I want to do it or not, doesn't matter, because that's what God wants me to do. And God created the universe, and God created everything material, and God created me, and God wants me to do this. If I'm a Jain, there's no God like that. I mean, Jain Dharma has a concept of God, but not that sort of concept, not a creator God. And so if I'm a Jain, there's no God telling me what I've got to do. There's no Tirthankara who tells me what I've got to do. My liberation, I seek vitaraga because I want to liberate myself, and liberation has nothing to do with what God does and God's tinkering with the universe. It has to do with the physics. It has to do with physics of jiv and ajiv and the involvement of karma, and my pulling one of the 148 sorts of karma into my atma, and how that manifests itself when it rises, and what I can do to stop it from rising or to make it go away. All right. Morality, particular issues of fundamental morality, cannot be accommodated in this framework. And this is my main point of this talk. You cannot use Anekantavada to talk about morality, because there is one truth in Jain Dharma, and that is Ahimsa. I mean, there are many truths, but that is the ultimate moral position, as Ahimsa. Okay. And so if morality is relative, then you could say, well, Ahimsa is a matter, it's, you know, if you think it's right, that's right. And if I think it's wrong, that's wrong. And it's a matter of, if you have, Jains cannot maintain that, because if they do, Jainism is meaningless, because Jainism is the Dharma of Ahimsa. More so than any other Dharma, it is the Dharma of Ahimsa. Although other Dharmas, other religious traditions talk about Ahimsa, Jain Dharma is Ahimsa. It is what it is. That is what it is. And so if you say everything is relative, then Ahimsa is relative. And Ahimsa is not a truth. And if you say Ahimsa is not a truth, I mean, and that presents a particular problem, because Ahimsa is true because it is the way to get to moksha, or liberation, because it is Ahimsa. It is the cessation of the vibration of the Atma, so that the Atma is not drawing any more karmic particles in. Ahimsa must be true. It is the basis of Jain Dharma, because it is the basis of moksha, or liberation, because it is what keeps the karma from coming in. It is the cessation. Ahimsa is not just a matter of not doing physical violence to people. Ahimsa is the complete cessation of the vibration of the soul. And so that's what Ahimsa is. And that is the only way to get to liberation, is to stop the vibration of the soul. Yes, it's good that we don't go beat people up and things like that, but that's just one manifestation of Himsa. There are many manifestations of Himsa. And whenever the soul is in a non-vitaraga state, whenever the soul is in a state of passion, of non-equanimity, the soul is in a state of Ahimsa, of Himsa. The only time we are in Ahimsa, a state of Ahimsa, is when we are in a state of Vitaraga. Okay. Now let's talk about veganism for a second, because, you know, I've been a vegan for actually
Gary,
my 30.
can I ask one question? I know I'm a bit late to ask when you asked everyone to have any question. Basically, I was just pondering in my mind. So like as you explain in Christianity and Jainism, so like in Christianity, for to have everything and that is related to God, that's why we should do something. And in Jainism we do because we believe there is no God, but for soul we need to do like love or whatever we good thing we should do. So is it in your understanding, are they just philosophy to understand life and cycle of life, or they they have a root in a way which is fundamental to the life?
Well, I think that both of them are maintaining that there are certain truths about the universe. I mean, the Jain position is that the truths of the universe are largely scientific truths of physics about souls and souls attracting karmic particles and how the karmic particles work. And it's there's nobody making it work. It is the way it works. Whereas in Christianity, you've got the idea that there's a God, a creator God, who judges, and, you know, who can forgive or not forgive, or, you know, can be harsher or less harsh or whatever. But I don't know that I would describe these as just sort of ways of understanding things, but rather these are metaphysical, ontological, metaphysical propositions. I don't think they can be understood as simply stories or narratives you know, that are basically reconcilable. They're not reconcilable. I mean, Jain Dharma is fundamentally different from Christianity because the origin, because what we need to do as Christians, we do because we love God and we want to make God happy. But ultimately, we are also frightened of God because God can condemn us to hell or some particular period in a non-heaven state, purgatory, or whatever you want to call it. But no, I believe these are very much metaphysical doctrines and ontological doctrines that tell us about what reality is. And so we might get to the same place. I mean, somebody who is a believer in Christian love might behave in a way which is similar to somebody who embraces Ahimsa and who does not believe in a creator God. Their behavior might be the same or similar, but the metaphysics of what they believe and why they believe it and why they are acting is very different. And I think that that's relevant. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I have one more question related to this, but I will ask at the end of session.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right. So let's talk about veganism, because I've been a vegan for now 39 years. I was a vegetarian first in the 1970s. And then I never knew what a vegan was. I'd never heard the word in my entire life. The word was coined in Britain in the 1940s. But I'd never heard the word before. I was not aware it was possible to live without consuming some animal products. I became a vegetarian because I thought eating meat was wrong because it involved killing animals. But I continued to eat dairy and eggs for a few years, and then I encountered vegan philosophy and I became a vegan immediately. There was no transition. I did it immediately. In October of 1982, I encountered the concept of veganism. I became a vegan in October of 1982. I have not eaten any animal products since October of 1982, and I haven't eaten meat since, I think, 1978. But in any event, most Jains are vegetarian. Relatively few are vegans. They consume dairy products such as milk, ghee, and butter. They use dairy, wool, and silk in puja events. They wear wool, silk, or leather products, and they use items that contain animal products. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm sure that I know some Jains who are not vegetarians. They've never identified themselves to me. Every Jain I've ever met, and I've met lots and lots of them, I've never met a Jain who at least admits to not being a vegetarian. But I've met tons and tons and tons of Jains who are not vegans. And whenever I talk to them about this, they tell me, Anekantavada, I get the Anekantavada, they wave the Anekantavada flag. And it was that reaction that I get from my Jain brothers and sisters that caused me to start doing this research in the first place, because I thought I better understand what this Anekantavada stuff is, because it's the reason that they tell me that they're not vegan, and I need to understand this. All right, so all animal products, including dairy and wool, involve inflicting suffering and death on mobile, multi-sensed beings. Some form of production are more brutal than others, but under the very best of circumstances, there is a great deal of suffering involved in the production of animal products. And the death, and this is important, the death of animals is a necessary aspect of any industry or practice that uses animals. Okay, so all animal products, not just meat, but all animal products involve suffering and death. Animals used in dairy production are kept alive longer than animals used for meat. They are treated as badly, if not worse, and they end up in the same slaughterhouses after which humans consume their bodies. So, I mean, this idea that there's some sort of radical separation between meat and dairy is just wrong. I mean, meat and dairy are inextricably intertwined. You can't separate them. There's no way you can separate them. I mean, so the male babies of dairy cows are sold into the veal industry. Most of the females are used in the dairy industry. So in other words, when the cow has a baby, if it's a male, that male is generally sold for veal. Sometimes they're killed outright. I mean, that happens in Britain. It happens in the United States. It happens in India, that they kill the males immediately on birth, but the ones they don't kill become veal calves. And the females become dairy cows. So there's an inextricable relationship between the meat industry and the dairy industry. There's not just a problem in the U.S. or other Western countries. This is from Statecraft. The word beef, and I'm just reading this small part to you. The word beef in India immediately conjures an image of sacred cows, but in fact, the beef and livestock industries are significant contributors to the Indian economy. The reality is that India exports more beef than any country in the world other than Brazil. It is second to Brazil. It exports more beef than the United States does. India is the largest milk producer with 22% of global milk production, 22%, followed by the United States, China, Pakistan, and Brazil. And that's from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. So you've got India being the second largest exporter of beef and the largest milk producer. Now, people say, well, but everything is great for cows in India. I hear that a lot too. That's false, but I hear it a lot. I want to read something from Sagar Shah, who's actually, I believe he may even be there. He may be even in on this presentation. I don't know. He lives in London, at least as far as I know, and he is a vegan Jain. And this is something that he wrote. He's done some terrific work on this issue. The treatment of cows and buffaloes associated with dairy cooperatives is full of violence. Cows and bulls are prematurely sent for slaughter, often across states. Cows often suffer from inflamed udders. Calves are separated from their mothers. There is an inadequate protection from the elements. There are cruel reproductive programs involving artificial insemination and crossbreeding with non-native breeds. Moreover, much of the other milk available in India comes from private dairies or tabalas, where conditions are even worse. And Sagar he spent a lot of time going around India and going to these various places. Some milk production may involve less himsa than other milk production, but it cannot be doubted that all milk production involves at least some himsa inflicted on mobile 5-sense beings. And many people still hold this idyllic concept of the dairy cow that grazes in the pasture, is provided with good care, and has a good life. If milk or other products come from an animal like that, how can that be morally problematic? Well, in the first place, no animal products do come from such animals. It's a fantasy. Almost all dairy products, wherever in the world they are produced, come from animals that are kept in intensive conditions of varying degrees, known as factory farming, that involve unspeakable brutality and violence. Even the animals who are supposedly raised in free-range circumstances, or whose products are advertised as organic, are raised in conditions that may, I say may, be slightly less brutal than the normal factory farm, but there is still a great deal of violence, suffering, and death. And when I say may, what I mean by that is this. If you're buying organic milk, one of the problems with organic milk is that when the cows get mastitis, normally in a non-organic situation, they give the cow antibiotics, which deals with the mastitis. And you end up drinking the antibiotics, but they give the cow antibiotics. In organic farming, they can't give the cows, in most places, they can't give them the antibiotics. So when the cow gets mastitis, she's just taken out of production until the mastitis goes away. And mastitis is a painful state of affairs. So even, we have this fantasy that there's some milk that we can get, that milk doesn't involve any violence. All milk involves violence, all of it. You can hypothesize situations in which that Ahimsa has been reduced to a very small amount, but there is still Ahimsa. And it is clear that we cannot justify imposing suffering or distress on mobile, multi-sense beings. As a matter of fact, I'm looking around for, hold on. Give me a minute. The Acharong Sutra, which I won't be able to find now. Hold on. Here it is. This is the Acharong Sutra, fourth lecture, book 1, lecture 4, lesson 2. The Arhats and Bhagavats of the past, present, and future all say thus, speak thus, declare thus, explain thus. All breathing, existing, living, sentient creatures should not be slain, nor treated with violence, nor abused, nor tormented, nor driven away. So it's not just killing them. It's not just killing them that's the problem. Because that's the standard reason for why Jains are vegetarians, because they believe that it's wrong to kill. But that's not what the doctrine tells us. Is it's not just a matter of not killing them. It's a question of not imposing suffering on them. And there is no such thing as dairy, which does not have Ahimsa, and in which you are not imposing some level, smaller or larger, degree of suffering on mobile, multi-sense beings. As a matter of fact, they're beings with 5 senses, just like us. Okay, so we are imposing suffering on mobile, multi-sense, 5-sense beings. The person who keeps only 1 cow on his or her property must keep that cow pregnant in order for the animal to give milk. And this means that there will be a steady stream of calves. In most cases, most, if not all of these calves end up on someone's table as veal. And whenever a calf is separated from her or his mother, there is a tremendous suffering from that alone. And I'm telling you, I've seen that. I've seen calves separated from their mothers. The mothers cry for days. They try to follow the calves. They'll even hurt themselves trying to follow their calves that are being taken away. It's absolutely horrible. And you've got to ask yourself, is that glass of milk, is the milk in your chai? I have chai, it's got soy milk, it's delicious. Is that glass of milk or that chai, is that milk in your chai or ghee or raita worth that suffering? The picture of the happy cow grazing in the pasture bears no relationship, my friends, to reality. The process of producing animal products, however supposedly humane it may be, involves Ahimsa. So the arguments is, it's possible. I mean, when I talk to my Jain brothers and sisters about this, they say, well, it's possible to produce milk without Ahimsa. The answer is no, it really isn't. But even if it were, everybody in the United States, United Kingdom, and other places, they have no access to that milk. If that milk exists in some theoretical world, it doesn't exist in the world in which you and I live. So we can't justify we can't justify engaging in himsa because ahimsa is possible in theory. I mean, I recently was talking to somebody who lives in Chicago, a Jain who lives in Chicago, and he was saying, well, I consume dairy because it's possible to produce dairy, without himsa. And I said, you live in Chicago. Can you tell me where in the city of Chicago you can buy milk that doesn't have himsa? Because I'm not aware of it. And I honestly believe that such a product doesn't exist. But even if it does exist, do you think you can buy it in Chicago? And if you can't buy it in Chicago, why are we having this discussion about whether it's okay for you to drink milk? Because it is possible in some possible world for milk to be produced in some way that does not involve himsa. The other argument that I get is it's tradition. Well, it's tradition. We just consume milk. I mean, Jainism developed in India. It's a religion which is small relative to Hinduism. Hinduism is a much larger tradition in India, and the two, it explains why in a Jain temple, you have, not in the Darasha where you've got the murtis, but around you have surrounding the surrounding areas, you have Hindu, you have Saraswati, and you have the various Hindu deities. It shows the synergy between Hindu Dharma and Jain Dharma, etc. And it's a tradition. It's what we've been doing for a long time. The answer is Jainism, if anything, is a tradition that demands rational examination. Tradition can never be a good answer when there is himsa involved. Can never be a good answer when there's himsa involved. It's not just a problem with dairy. The shearing of sheep for wool involves an unspeakable amount of violence. The animals are frightened. Their bodies are often cut and injured. Much wool comes from sheep that are on their way to the slaughterhouse and used for wool. And sheep used for wool are eventually slaughtered. They don't die of old age. Silk is produced by boiling silkworms alive. Leather involves wearing the skin of an animal who has endured suffering and a violent death at the hands of humans. So, I mean, all of these products involve, I remember once being in the temple in Queens, New York, and there was a sign before you went into where the murtis were. There was a sign saying you can't wear leather. Take your watch bands off, and well, no one has their shoes on anyway, but they take your watch bands off. So the man I was with said, "Does your watch have leather?" I said, "There's nothing I have. I don't own any leather. I don't own anything that has leather." And afterwards, I said to him, "It's odd that you will not allow leather in the Darasha, in the area where the murtis are, but you wear leather. That's strange to me. If it's not something you should wear when you're by the murtis, why should you wear them? Why should you wear leather at all? I mean, it's very strange. It makes no sense to me." The bottom line is meat involves himsa, but so do all other animal products. Veganism is the only position that's consistent with ahimsa. And remember, all animal products involve animal deaths, but it's not just killing that's himsa. Okay, that's the thing I just read you from the Acharong Sutra. It's not just killing. Yes, I understand meat involves killing. You have to be dead before you can eat them. I understand that. But that's not the extent of himsa. Himsa is causing any agitation, any torment, any violence, any suffering to mobile, multi-sense beings, any of it. That's forbidden. The fallback position, Anekantavada, we must be pluralistic. We cannot be absolute. But when it comes to ahimsa, especially himsa involving mobile, multi-sense beings, Jains must be absolutist. Think about it. If it's not absolute, on what principle ground can we reject the himsa of meat if one is not obligated to reject the himsa of dairy or wool? This is an extremely important question. If Anekantavada allows us to consume dairy or wool, then what do you say to the Jain who says, I'm not a vegetarian because it's Anekantavada? And, it's your opinion that meat is forbidden. It's my position that it's not. And so therefore it's Anekantavada. You cannot say that. So you cannot say that there's an absolute truth about meat. I've never met a Jain who would agree with that. Never. Not once have I ever met a Jain who would say that the morality of meat is a relative matter depending on what one's views are, and that it's a matter of Anekantavada. But I meet lots and lots of Jains who say dairy and wool are matters of Anekantavada. Jains generally don't eat dairy, don't eat eggs, but they will eat eggs if they're contained in cakes and things like that. I mean, I'm aware of that, but and eggs are also quite horrible. But to use Anekantavada in this way is to reduce Jain relativism to Western relativism, and they are very different. Jain relativism has nothing to do with Western relativism. Jain relativism is a relativism about our knowledge of substances. And it doesn't deny that there's an absolute reality. It just says because we're not Keval Gyan, we can't know it. That's what is being maintained with Jain relativism. So Jain relativism is actually not really relativism in the sense of denying a truth. It's just saying we can't know the truth. Whereas Western relativism is there's no truth. It's like a matter of time. It's a matter of culture. It's a matter of all sorts of things. But it's not a matter of truth. That's completely not what Jain relativism is. The issue of war. Many Jains defend war to protect one's country. Again, Ahimsa would seem to rule out war, or at the very least require that wars be just. I mean, it's not just veganism. I mean, I think one can have an interesting. I see a lot of writing about a Jain saying, well, war to defend one country is okay. Well, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting position, but it would seem to me that Ahimsa would seem to rule out war. That at the very least. One would have to make sure that the war is just. One can't just simply say, I'm going to defend my country, right or wrong, and war is okay to defend my country, right or wrong. That simply can't be right, and it can't be a matter of Ahimsa. In conclusion, Anekantavada, Nyayavad, and Sayadavad pertain to substances, not to moral situations. And these doctrines do not deny absolute truth. So it's different from Western relativism in the sense that Jain relativism does not deny moral truth, but it also doesn't apply to moral situations. It applies to substances. But because the soul, Jeev, is a substance, these doctrines mean we cannot, unless we have Keval Gyan, know a person's soul. So I think it's very important, and I'm very, very careful. I always am careful I don't judge a non-vegan as a bad person. Why? Because I don't have Keval Gyan. I don't understand the person's atma. I can't see the person's atma. I can't know the aspects of the person's atma. I can say I think what the person's doing is inconsistent with Ahimsa, but I can't make a judgment about the individual person. But I can judge Himsa to exist where it exists. So I can say to you, look, I'm not saying you're a bad person because I don't know. I'm not Keval Gyan. I don't know your soul. But I can tell you that you are engaging in a behavior which involves Himsa, and it can't be excused by saying, well, it's a matter of Anekantavada. I'm not engaging in Himsa if I don't think I'm engaging in Himsa. No, Himsa is a matter of Himsa is a matter of fact. When you are engaging in the sutras are clear about this, when you're engaging in any activity which not only kills but causes distress to or suffering to a mobile multi-sense being, that is Himsa. That is what we are taught, and it seems to make perfect sense. But because the soul is a substance, these doctrines mean, okay, well, okay. But okay, now I'm sure I've offended a lot of people out there. Michami Dukadam, or Omaraham, and now you can proceed to tell me why you think I'm wrong. but I will argue with you, but in a nonviolent way. All right.
Thank you very much, Gary. What
Yes.
a wonderful and inspiring talk. Gary covered on some of the fundamental tenets of Jainism, Anekantavada, one of them, which is, I think, not many even Jains do understand them in that much more detail. Gary also conveyed that veganism is required to commit to Ahimsa, which is, again, a fundamental tenet of Jainism. Anekantavada is casually understood by most people as everyone is right from their own perspective. However, Gary maintains that Anekantavada cannot excuse or immunize non-veganism simply because Anekantavada cannot coherently be applied to moral issues. I think Anekantavada and related doctrines of Sayadavad and Nyayavad pertain to knowledge of substances. And I think Gary made that very, very clear, and are not doctrines of moral relativism, which is kind of prevalent in the Western society. Thus, whether veganism is morally required or not is a matter of individual decision. And I think Gary, again, was very explicit in his saying that, it's not for him to dictate, but he thinks that it's a matter of matter of individual decision, according to Gary, since it's implicitly encompassed within Ahimsa. Gary is so passionate about animal rights And it gives me great pleasure to actually invite Venda Shehata, who runs a vegan animal sanctuary in East Sussex, to actually thank Gary for making the time to talk to us. So, these are the two areas, animal activism and veganism. And Venda has probably one of the only ones of its kind in the UK to have a vegan animal sanctuary. So may I kindly request Venda to actually thank Gary, and then we'll have some time for questions if there's any other questions towards the end.
Gary, Arham, I want to thank you on behalf of everybody here today for sharing with us your amazing knowledge, your love of Jainism and love of animal rights combined, that in my mind are inseparable. We've all learned a lot from your lecture, and I think that many of us will be left with so much to consider. Those of us who are not yet vegan will, from what you have said to us today, must at least consider what they're doing. I'm sure no one has been left untouched by your knowledge and what you have taught us. I just want to thank you because it's so important that we never stop educating ourselves and we never stop listening to those who are more educated than we are. And I believe that most of us today will have learned more than one thing. We will go away and we'll be able to question. And I believe in Jainism, we should question and put everything to the test, and we will find the truth. What is most important is that we need to live a lifestyle, whether we're born Jain, whether we are drawn to Jainism, whether we practice a vegan and Jain lifestyle, or whether we're still tottering on the edge of vegetarianism within Jainism. But thank you most humbly from all of us. It has been a wonderful 45 minutes listening to you. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. What I always do, Wenda, is, when I became a vegetarian, as I said, I became a vegetarian, I think in 78. But I continued eating dairy. And so I drank milk. As a matter of fact, I was obsessed with ice cream. I used to eat huge amounts of ice cream. It's amazing I've lived this long that I didn't completely clog my arteries. But I ate a lot of ice cream, and I'm a New Yorker from Italian descent. So I used to eat lots of cheese pizza. And when I learned, when I became a vegan, as I say, I became a vegan literally overnight. Somebody gave me something to read, and I read, and I encountered the word veganism for the first time. And I learned about dairy, because being a New Yorker, my only interaction with cows was when I ate them. And I did not know, and I confess ignorance here, I didn't know that cows had to be pregnant to give milk. I thought cows were just animals that gave milk. They automatically gave milk. And I didn't know they had to be pregnant. And then I learned about, that the thing that I was given to read explained to me about veal calves and stuff. And then I stopped immediately. And for a while, at the time, it was 1982. And so there wasn't a lot of, now they have all of these soy or coconut ice creams and stuff like that. And they have, they have fake cheese and whatnot. But then they didn't have that stuff back then. And I remember after I became a vegan, and a couple of days later, I was walking past Ray's Pizza in Greenwich Village. And it had that great smell that it was the best cheese pizza in the world. And I thought, I'm going to go in and have a piece. And then I thought about the mother cow and about taking her babies away from her, and about her babies being turned into veal. And even if they weren't turned into veal, just the suffering of the separation. And I said to myself, is there anything you really want to eat that badly that you would support that? And it was an existential moment in my life, because I saw the question that way. Is there anything that matters to me that much that I would participate in the infliction of that level of suffering? And I said, no, I can't do it. And then it was easy. After that moment, as I was walking past Ray's Pizza on, I think it was on Christopher Street in Greenwich Village. That was the end of it. That was the end of it. I stopped. And well, I didn't eat the pizza then, but I mean, so I had stopped on that Friday night in October. I never have eaten an animal product since. And you know, and I really think that, you know, I always say to my Jain brothers and sisters, you care about nonviolence. It's the basis of your life. Why are you participating? This is violence. You know, I mean, I'm not saying you're a bad person because I don't know. I can't judge you, but I can tell you that product comes from suffering. I've seen it. I've been on those farms before. And, you know, and I know where it comes from. And however humane, supposedly humane is, however it is, there's at least some suffering, and any suffering on trasa, on mobile multi-sense beings, you can't justify that. And so, you know, it even, I remember a few years ago, I offered to pay, you know, we have this big conference in North America, the North American Jain Federation has the Jaina conference. And so I offered to pay for all of the vegan ice cream, because I know that getting between a Jain and sweet desserts is a prescription for disaster. I know that. And so I said I would pay for the Jain, you know, for all of the vegan ice cream. And I was told, they said it was going to cost a lot of money. I was willing to do that because I thought this is a conference of 4 days. We talk about Ahimsa while people are sitting there eating all this stuff and putting milk in their chai and you know, ghee in the, you know, and paneer in their various meals. And when it's all completely unnecessary, I offered to pay for soy to replace the paneer. I offered to get, plant-based things to replace the ghee. Nobody, you know what? Nobody would have even known. If it was not presented as vegan, nobody would have known it was vegan, but they wouldn't do it. And the answer I kept on getting was Anekantavada. That's actually what motivated it. And I thought, I got to understand what this is because it doesn't make any sense to me. And I didn't know what Anekantavada was. I didn't understand the Buddhist. I understood Buddhist worldviews. But I didn't understand how this evolved in the 14th and 15th centuries. I didn't understand that at all until I researched it. And so so then now, you know, that particular conference, I actually water fasted for the 4 days. I did not eat food. I water fasted. And I said, y'all want to sit there and eat that violence? That's your business. I ain't going to participate in it. And I'm not going to eat anything. And so now I don't even go to the Jaina conferences anymore. But for the 4 days, I water fast. I actually fast. I try to fast 1 day a week. But during the Jaina convention, I fast for 4 days. And because it makes me very sad that you have this great conference of Ahimsa, and there's so much Himsa there. And it's just, you know, and I have to tell you, the number of times I have given talks to non-Jain audiences in which I'm talking about veganism, and I talk about the violence of dairy. And you know what I get? People say to me, you're involved with those Jain people, aren't you? Well, the Jains don't think it's violent. They eat dairy. And then I have to deal with that. So it becomes really very difficult. But thank you for your kind words. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Gary, for those kind words. In fact, we are going to be very privileged to actually have Wenda talk to us next Sunday. And, so we welcome everyone who's joined in today for this talk to join in next week. I mean, I would actually classify Wenda as the Mother Teresa for animals. I mean, I've heard her once or twice before, and the way she treats the animals, it's just been so wonderful. And it just makes you wonder that, you know, we have compassion towards humans, but how Wenda extends that to animals and even on a vegan basis is going to be quite enlightening to us. So again, welcome everyone next Sunday for Wenda's talk. There have been 1 or 2 questions, Gary. There's a question from Panna Shah. She's asking, can you comment on the morality in the mode of transportation? So what's your views on the morality involved in the mode of transportation?
You mean using animals for transportation?
Or kind of the violence kind of involved when, you know, because when you say when we're using transportation, that would involve some kind of ahimsa to kind of 5 sense living beings. So, you know, how would you draw, what are your views on kind of modes of transportation? So you yourself would probably be using modes of transportation which might involve ahimsa of five sense living beings?
Well, I'm not sure what you're referring to. I mean, for example, I don't drive my car when it's raining because there are frogs crossing, the frogs always, so I generally avoid driving when it's raining. I drive only when it's absolutely necessary. And I'm sure that I probably run over bugs and things like that. And I don't want to do that, what Jainism teaches us, one of the most profound things I learned when I started studying Jainism 30 some odd years ago, actually longer than that, was that living in the material world inevitably involves violence. You can't, I mean, that's the problem with living in the material world. You cannot live in the material world in an ahimsic way unless you become like Mahavir and you go and you meditate for 3 years and you're not moving and you're in a complete state of equanimity. But that living in the material world in a non-vitiraga way necessarily involves violence. Now, I try to minimize that to the extent possible, and it's absolutely and there is a difference between you try to minimize it to the degree possible. Certainly, when you're consuming milk, you're involved with inflicting suffering on an animal that's a panchandriya. It's a 5 cents animal. We are panchandriya, they're panchandriya, and so you see the problem there. But I try to avoid it. I don't walk on grass. I remember I went to a Jain facility not far from here, which is hundreds of acres, and people go walking on the grass, and they wanted me to go for a walk, and I said I don't walk on grass. And when I walk on pavement, I'm always looking down to make sure I'm not stepping on ants or whatever. I walk my dogs. I have 5 rescued dogs. They're all vegans, by the way. I have 5 rescued vegan dogs. And when we go walking, I'm always looking down at the ground and making sure that I'm not stepping on any insects. I try my best. I never kill insects in the house. Yesterday, there was a spider that we live in a slightly rural, we don't live in New York anymore. We live in rural Pennsylvania. And there was a spider that must have been it was a very large spider and had hair. I mean, it was a large spider. And frankly, it was a little bit frightening. And I had to sort of get the glass and capture the spider and get the spider outside. And I was sort of shaking. But, I don't kill things in my house. And so, you just do the best you can do. I also think, I mean, look, I'm a vegan because I believe in ahimsa, and because I believe that it's wrong to do that, to engage in any sort of violence in that way. However, we also have to be aware, non-veganism is destroying this planet. So, I mean, it is destroying this planet. If we were all vegans, we would cut down the amount of land that we need to produce crops by an area the size of Africa. And that is an enormous continent, because it takes so many pounds of plant protein to produce a pound of meat. It takes so many pounds of plant protein to produce a gallon of milk. It takes so much plant protein to produce a dozen eggs. So the conversion ratios are completely inefficient. And the contribution to global warming, I mean, we put more greenhouse gas in the environment from animal agriculture than we do from the burning of all fossil fuel for transportation. So, and I also try to get my Jain friends, when you go to these Jain conferences, there's more styrofoam used. I mean, everybody's, styrofoam dishes and plastic cups and stuff. And you think, my God, this, why are we doing this? I mean, this is like an ecological disaster. But we need to recognize that animal agriculture is destroying the environment, and it's also doing violence to our health. It's also doing violence to our health. I mean, there's a reason why Indians, many of whom are vegetarians, still have heart disease at a much higher rate than they should. Why is that? Because they're consuming a lot of dairy. Dairy is deadly for heart disease. I remember Chitrabanuji, who's now dead, but Chitrabanu, who was a Jain monk who stopped being a Jain monk and came to the United States and actually lived in Manhattan, was a very good friend, he and Pramoda Ben. Chitrabanu he had I mean, he died at 96, but when he was a vegetarian, but before he became a vegan, he had been consuming so much dairy that he had he had heart disease before he became a vegan, even though he had been a lifelong vegetarian because he was Jain. So he's a lifelong vegetarian, but he was not a vegan. He had heart disease, and without being, even though he was a vegetarian. So this is something we need to be, because it's the violence to our bodies. It's not only the violence that we're doing to their bodies, it's the violence that we're doing to our bodies by putting those products into our bodies. I have to tell you, I eat very sensible. I don't eat the one thing I don't do. I make a lot of Indian food. I love Indian food. I'm obsessed with Indian food, and I make lots of it. But the one thing I don't do is I don't use salt. I don't, because salt will kill you. But I eat a very healthy vegan diet, and I have to tell you, I've got the energy of somebody 30 years younger than I am. You were right. It was my birthday yesterday, and I'm getting into my late 60s, and I don't feel in my late 60s at all, because I am, I'm a vegan, and I eat, just fruits, vegetables, plant, grains, beans, seeds, and I don't fry things. You can make great Indian food without using oil. Actually, to be honest with you, you don't need ghee. You certainly don't need ghee. You don't even need plant-based ghee. I make it without any of that sort of stuff, and it's delicious. I'd like to cook for you sometime. We're hoping to spend more. My wife is from Nottingham, so we're hoping to spend more time in Britain starting next year. And I'm hoping that I can invite you and all of my Jain friends over for dinner, and I will cook an Indian meal for you. And I defy you to tell me that it's not as good as stuff that's got animal products in it. But
thank you very much for your kind invitation, Gary. That's very kind of you. Looking forward to that, and hope to connect with you when you come to the UK. There was actually a question from Susan Harris. Susan, I think it's quite a detailed question. If you would just like to pose a question directly to Gary, I think you can unmute yourself, Susan Harris.
Yeah. Hi, that was really inspiring. I've been working recently on problems raised by multiculturalism, and I was thinking in the context of your talk, if Anekantavada could consider problems raised or questions raised by multiculturalism in some other way, because Western relativism in many ways condones or justifies minority cultural practices that involve eating meat by saying we can't really know about their culture, and that it's another way of living, and therefore everything is relative. So I was wondering if Anekantavada could maybe offer a way to think about some of these problems. And I also had a doubt whether this phrase that you kept using about mobile multi-sense beings, if that is a literal translation or a concept from some Jain literature, because I'm not familiar with it. But thanks.
yes, I think yes, it is. It's mobile multi-sense beings there are different levels of beings, and mobile multi-sense beings, which I think the correct word, but if anybody knows, is I think trasa is, and refers to mobile multi-sense beings. I'm hoping, Susan, that I'm not going to reach moksha in this lifetime, but I'm hoping that if I lead a good enough life, the next time I will be reborn, hopefully in a Gujarati family, because then I will know Gujarati and be able to talk to other Jains in their native language. But I also will then know Hindi, and that will make it easier for me to learn Sanskrit and Prakrit, which will make life a lot easier, because it's very hard to do work. I mean, I'm relegated to doing my research in English sources. I've got about 300 Jain books, including all of the Agams. I've got a complete set of all of the Agams, but they're all English, and one doesn't know about, what one never knows about the quality of these, I'm always nervous when I do these presentations because they're based on things I've read in English. Now, Prabhupada Jain, who unfortunately just died last week, scholars like that, I can rely on their stuff, but you just don't know whether it's accurate or not. Go back to your first question. That's a really interesting question. I'm not a cultural relativist because, if somebody says to me, well, there are cultures, you can't make statements about whether cultures have right or wrong practices. And the answer is, I'm not a cultural relativist, because there are some cultures, for example, that practice female genital mutilation on non-consenting children, on 9 and 10-year-old girls. Well, if you're a cultural relativist and you take the position that we can't, we can't make a statement about the validity of cultural practices, then you're stuck with saying that you can't say that female genital mutilation is wrong. I have no problem saying female genital mutilation is absolutely wrong. That is not to say that I think the United States should invade countries that practice female genital. That's a different question. But I mean, I recently had a conversation with some students, and they were saying, well, but if my food tradition, they were talking about, that they had certain food traditions where meat was important. And I said, well, every culture has, with few exceptions, every culture has food traditions that involve meat. You could look at sexism. Sexism is a cultural tradition. It just happens to be ubiquitous. Sexism and misogyny is practiced by basically every culture in the world. As a matter of fact, sexism may be the longest standing cultural norm in the history of humankind. That doesn't make it right, in my view. So I think that we have to, I understand that there is a trend, and a lot of young people want to say that, well, you can't be a cultural imperialist. I'm not a cultural imperialist. I'm a moral realist. I believe that moral norms, particularly the norm of Ahimsa, applies to everybody. Nobody gets a pass for, you don't get a pass because you have traditions which are which are himsic. Think about it. All the tradition is, Susan, is we do something for a long time. So we say, well, we've done it for a long time, so we ought to be able to do it continue doing it. So what? We've been doing it for a long time. We've been doing lots of things for a long time. Many of them are wrong. Sexism is one thing. Violence is one thing. Wars are very, 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 everybody engages in wars. You know what? Tough. That doesn't mean that they're okay. No, they're not okay. Any violence like that is not okay. And so, I think we have to be careful about this. We're in a time right now when it's becoming increasingly politically unpopular to be a moral realist and to sort of reject relativism of various sorts, whether it's because cultural relativism is simply nothing more but moral relativism applied in a cultural way. That's all it is. And so if we want to say, that cultural relativism is okay, then you can't criticize female genital mutilation. You can't criticize all sorts of practices. You can't criticize bride burning and things like that. Those are cultural traditions in some places. So you can't criticize them. I think we have to be careful about this. There's a difference between accepting what everybody's culture is and saying it's great, and sort of saying, well, I'm not judging you because this is the culture you come from, but you've got to take a look at these things from a critical perspective. And this idea that everybody's right and nobody's wrong, I'm sorry, that just doesn't work, because that's the world we're living in now. And I think that, and we're going increasingly that direction. I think that's a really bad idea. I think we ought to be careful not to have artificial norms, but where we think that those norms reflect moral reality. I happen to believe that Ahimsa reflects moral reality. I'm not a relativist. I believe it doesn't matter whether I'm an American of Italian origin who was raised as a Catholic, or you're, Indian raised as a Jain, or, what, it doesn't really matter. There are certain things which are true for both of us. And one of those things, there may not be a lot of things which are true for both of us, but one of those things which is true for both of us is Ahimsa. And the fact that you engage in, if you engage in it in violence, and, that doesn't, because it's some culture, it reflects some cultural tradition you have, that doesn't make it okay. We have to be very, very careful, because tradition is the enemy in many ways of Jain Dharma. Jain Dharma prides itself on rationality. And tradition is a rejection of rational thinking and an acceptance of something simply because of behaviors, past behaviors, that can't be consistent with Jainism. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you very much, Gary. I think, yeah, that was I hope, Susan, that answers your question. I think in the interest of, yeah, sorry, is there any other question?
I'm a vegan. I have endless energy. I'll sit and answer questions all day if you want. I did a 5-hour, I did 2 presentations yesterday, one in Kazakhstan and one in Thailand. And I did, they were basically 2.5 hours each. So I did like 5 hours yesterday. As I say, I'm a vegan. I have endless energy. But
there's a quick question. What's your views on figs and honey? Gary, what are your views on?
I don't eat honey because it's an animal product. I understand, I think I understand the issue with figs, although I'm not 100% sure I understand the issue with figs. Is it that there are insects which are dead inside of it? Once something's dead, I'm not a big fan of figs. I just don't particularly care for them one way or another. But if the issue is that there are organisms inside which are dead, then they're not capable of suffering anymore, and that you can't harm them. You can't harm a dead thing because a dead thing has no interests which can be compromised. So it doesn't really concern me that terribly much. But I don't eat honey because honey does involve. I don't know whether bees are certainly mobile. How sentient they are, I don't know. But I don't know whether clams or mussels are sentient, but I don't eat them because I err in favor of saying, well, they may be sentient, so I don't want to harm them. Bees are actually, they behave in ways which make it very difficult to deny that they are not only sentient, but that they have fairly complex cognition. Which is sort of mysterious because they're little tiny things and they don't, but they're really quite interesting. And when you produce honey, you're taking, that involves not only Ahimsa, but it involves stealing. You're taking something which is intended for their use. And commercial honey involves burning the hives at the end of the season because you don't want to have to feed them over the winter. So the bees are basically killed in the hives. And so I don't participate in that. I haven't consumed honey since I haven't consumed anything like any animal product since 1982, including honey.
Great.
So,
one more question, Gary. There's a question says, is veganism practical in extremely poor countries which have got a lot of food insecurity? I'm sure like in the States, as in the UK, following a vegan diet is actually, it's quite expensive. It's a lifestyle. So the question is, do you think that, you are so passionate about veganism? How do you think that's practical in extremely poor countries?
Well, I think veganism is practical everywhere. I have a website called howigovegan.com. And we've got a bunch of recipes on there, cheap, easy vegan recipes. Eating vegan is invariably cheaper than eating animal products. So, fruits, vegetables, beans, grains, seeds, these things cost less than meat, dairy, and eggs. I've done comparison shopping things. The problem with poor nations is not that they don't have food. It's not that they don't have vegetables, they don't have food. And in a lot of these poor places, what's happening is the crops are being grown to feed to animals that are going to be fed to people in richer countries. And so the grains are basically the plant protein is actually being funneled into animals that are going to be shipped off, that are going to be processed and shipped off to Western countries. And so that's a serious problem. There are food justice issues. I completely agree. There are food justice issues that are connected with political issues. And I'm one of those Jains. I'm one of those Jains who's a political Jain, and I believe I embrace socialism. I believe very much in democratic socialism, and I think that we have an obligation to share. Look, if we were all vegans, we could feed the whole world. The amount of plants that we produce in the United States alone, we produced enough plants we could feed 800 million people, and we're feeding that stuff to cows and pigs and goats and sheep that we're going to slaughter and eat. If just in the United States, 800 million people could eat if we did not eat animal products. My view is that this is not just an issue of justice for non-human animals. This is an issue of justice for humans. You know, I don't want to live in a world where people are starving because rich people in the West want to eat meat, or because as India becomes more prosperous, the meat consumption goes up, or China or Japan. You know, as populations get more, I mean, China, I mean, look at China. I mean, you know, China has increased its meat consumption dramatically, and also has increased its cancer rate and its heart disease rate. But you know, I think that you know, I have recipes on that site, because I know I've developed them and I've worked with people who developed them. There's a woman I work with in Ireland, a professor of medieval studies, who's also a vegan. And she and I and Anna, my partner, have worked on developing recipes where we've got great, healthy recipes that you can make, feed a family of 4 for like $3 and things like that. I mean, lentils are very cheap, and lentils are a great source of protein. You can buy lentils for very, very little money. All you need are lentils, spices, and some grain, some rice. And you've got an extremely protein complementary, very, very healthy thing. I mean, veganism is only expensive in places like the United Kingdom and the United States, because we go to these places like, we have Whole Foods here. I think you have them in London there, but you have, you know, the Waitroses and all of these expensive shops where you go and you buy these, you know, these things, you know, the actually processed vegan foods, like these fake, you know, the fake meats and all of the various things. This is very expensive. I don't eat that stuff. First of all, it's got a lot of salt in it, and secondly, it has no nutritive value. And they are expensive. But I mean, my shopping bill, I spend a lot of money. I buy vegan dog food for my dogs. It's actually more expensive than most of the food I buy for me. But you know, you can be a vegan very, very cheaply. So I think, you know, but I am concerned about poor nations. But I'm concerned about poor nations because somebody's making money off of them. There should be no power. We live in a world in which there is tremendous wealth. The problem is too few people share it. Sure. And what we need, and I believe that material accumulation is a form of Ahimsa. And one has to, you know, I mean, one has to share. I mean, we give a certain amount away every year because we believe that, you know, that is what nonviolence requires that we do. And I think that we need, you know, we all need to realize that acquisitiveness is itself presents a serious issue of violence.
That's great. Thank you. I think we actually run out. I know we have overshoot the actual time, but there's still a few questions coming up through. Are you okay, Gary, to have a couple of questions? Or...
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Of course.
Okay. May I kindly ask Dr. Mehul Sangrachkai, who would like to ask a question? So if you'd like to unmute yourself, Mehul, fine.
Thank you so much, Rajiv Bhai, and Gary, an amazing talk. Absolutely loved it. I have 3 questions, and my apologies for the greed, but I have 3 questions that I just wanted to run past you. So firstly, do you think the concept of drinking milk in India is relatively new? And the reason I ask that is because when you read Acharong Sutra and the others, they talk about the way you should, you know, treat animals and you know, how you should behave with them, but they don't talk about the idea of milk specifically. And I just wonder whether this is a much later addition. The second is when, you know, you look at veganism, you see nowadays, you know, Beyond Meat burgers and, you know, soya everything that's supposed to look, taste, and smell like meat substitutes. Is that Ahimsa as well, in your view? That, you know, it reminds you of, you know, the act of violence in that. And the last question is, do you think we suppress the actual consciousness and the, you know, of sentient beings, of these 5 sense beings, in the fact that they're far more intelligent than we give them credit for, simply because, you know, they're part of the meat industry?
three fascinating questions. I don't know about, I mean, I've heard different people say different things about the history of drinking milk. I've heard people say it's relative, it's certainly a practice of long standing in India. How long the long standing is a matter of debate. I've heard people say that it's very, very old, and I've heard people say that it's not very old. I don't know the answer to that question. It wouldn't surprise me if it's very old, in that the cow has had this central role in Hinduism for a very long time. And I don't know whether that was incidental to drinking milk or whether that was an occasion for drinking milk. I simply don't know. The second question that you ask about, I don't eat any of the fake meats. I don't. As a matter of fact, I think they're disgusting. Now, I am not a Jain. Well, I am a Jain, but I'm not an Indian Jain. So I wasn't born a vegetarian. I ate meat until I was in my 20s, a lot of it actually. And as a matter of fact, I didn't really much like vegetables, and I ate tons and tons of meat. And as I said, I was obsessed with ice cream. I really should be dead at this point. It's amazing I've lived this long. I would have taken much better care of myself if I knew I lived this long. But I ate lots of meat. So you know, if a Jain, an Indian Jain, a born Jain, who's a vegetarian, eats this stuff, they're not familiar with meat, so they're just eating something, and you know, they're told that it tastes like meat, but they don't know because they've never eaten meat. I tried some of that stuff, and I have to say it tastes a whole lot like meat, and it disgusts me because it does remind me of the fact that I ate meat for a long time, and I don't really want to be reminded of that. And I remember once, many years ago, I attended a Thanksgiving celebration. Thanksgiving is an American holiday where people stuff themselves with food in acts of unspeakable gluttony. I mean, it's outrageous. And we went to someone's house, and they had a tofurkey, and it had this skin that was made from bean curd.
Yeah.
But I had a piece of it, and it tasted just like my recollection of what turkey skin tasted like. And I actually had to remove it from my mouth because it nauseated me. I mean, it was horrifying. I don't eat any of that stuff. You know, do I think it's Ahimsa? I actually do think it's Ahimsa. I don't really get into this with a lot of non-Jain people because they don't understand. I mean, you know, when I'm talking to people about animal rights and they're not Jains, I always work in nonviolence. That's always part of my talk, but I'm not talking about Jain. I'm not talking about Vitaraga. I'm not talking about, you know, the vibration of the Atma. I'm not talking about any of that. You know, I'm not talking about no attachment, no aversion. I'm not talking about that. And so if I were to say to most of these folks, I don't consume those products because I think they involve violence, they wouldn't understand what I was talking about, because they would say, well, but there are no animals that have been killed for that. And I'd say, well, yes, but they don't understand, you know, the Bhav Himsa. They just don't. That's not a concept that Western people are really very much into, and so it wouldn't make sense to them. But no, I don't eat it myself. I do consider it to be morally problematic for me as a Jain, because the only way I could consume that in my situation as somebody who once ate meat would be that I wanted to be reminded of the violence. I wanted to be favorably reminded of the violence that I once participated in. Although I don't know that would be true of a born Jain vegetarian who was just eating it because it's not that they want to be reminded of anything, because there's nothing to remind them of. And so I think it may have a different himsic or a different karmic effect, not a himsic. It may have a different karmic effect on the born Jain vegetarian than it does on me. On me, I think it would have an ill-advised karmic effect. The third question you asked, absolutely. As a matter of fact, let me run and get this quickly. This is this is my most recent book. I think it comes out in the United Kingdom next week. It just came out here. It's called Why Veganism Matters, the Moral Status of Animals. And it's just a book Columbia University Press just published. And what I argue in this book is that the whole Western thinking about animal welfare is wrong, because it's based on Jeremy Bentham in the 19th century comes up and says, well, what difference does it make if animals can't think or can't reason? As long as they can suffer, they matter morally. But the Western idea of animals is that they can't think, or that they can't think in sophisticated ways, and they have no interest in their lives. So it's okay to kill them as long as we don't cause them a lot of suffering. And I basically explained that because they're property, we're always going to cause them a lot of it. I mean, it's more complicated than that. But what I get into the whole idea, they say, well, because animals are property, the level of animal welfare is always going to be low. And because animals are economic commodities, it costs money to protect their interests. And so the level of protection is always going to be very, very low. And then I argue that as long as they're sentient, subjectively aware, that's all I require for personhood. I articulate a theory of personhood in the book, which is based only on sentience. And I say that any sentient being has a morally significant interest in continuing to live. And the problem is, I agree that animals are much more cognitively sophisticated than we give them credit for. The problem is we'll never know. And by making it rest on whether or not they have this belief, or that whether or not they have rationality the way we understand rationality, whether or not they can use abstract thoughts the way we use abstract thoughts, we have no idea, and we'll never know for sure. And the problem, this is the problem I call the similar minds problem, that in order for them to matter morally, they've got to have minds similar to us. We'll never know whether they have. I mean, I have 5 dogs. Do they think? Of course they think. I mean, I couldn't explain their behavior if I didn't attribute something going on with them cognitively. But do they think the way I think? No, I don't think that they do, because I think in terms of concepts which are related to language. I don't know what it is to think without language. I'm an animal who thinks, whose concepts are related to language. I don't know what it is to think without language. Do my dogs think? Absolutely. That's absolutely clear to me. It's a mystery to me how they think, because they don't use language, but they clearly think. They're clearly self-aware. They're not self-aware in the sense that I'm self-aware. They can't look at themselves in a mirror and say, oh, hi, I look good today, or I look bad today, or I mean, they can't think that way. But are they self-aware? And the answer is, of course, they're self-aware. They're self-aware in a different way, but they clearly are aware of themselves and the separation of themselves from the others. I mean, they play with each other. You can't engage in play behavior if you're not self-aware on some level. You just can't do it. And so do animals think? Do they have concepts? And the answer is, they certainly have equivalents of our concepts. I don't know what they're like. And this is the problem when we say, well, they only matter if they have certain concepts. We're never going to know. That's a game that animals will never win. So when people say, well, we'll stop eating them when we find out that they're capable of this level of cognition or that, I mean, this is an argument I have with people like Peter Singer, because even Peter Singer links moral value with complex cognition. Tom Reagan, he's a philosopher who talks about animal rights. He links animal rights with complex cognition. My view is we're never going to know. We're never ever going to know how animals think. So we'll never be able to decide, even if we'll never be able to decide whether they have the characteristic that we think is magical and gives them a morally significant interest in life. We're never going to know whether they have that with any sort of certainty. We'll always dispute that. And so my view is that we need to get away from that sort of speciesist anthropocentric thinking, as long as they're sentient. That's all that matters to me. And you know what? That's the way we think where humans are concerned. If you have a human and that human is severely mentally disabled, is not able to reason, is not able to use concepts, is sort of stuck in an eternal present, is not even able to think about the future. I mean, you have somebody who's at the very last stages of severe dementia, very last stages, where that person is stuck in an eternal present. Is that human still a person? I.e., does that human still have a morally significant interest in life? Well, the Jain answer is, of course, because the being's alive. But the philosophical answer for me, the non-Jain philosophical answer is, of course, that person still is connected to a future self in terms of the next second of consciousness. And as long as that is there, it doesn't really matter whether how complex the cognition is. It doesn't mean you would hire such a person to be a math lecturer at the University of London, but so a person in that mental state is not equal to normally functioning humans. But for the purpose of whether or not we use a normally functioning human or this person who's in late stage dementia as a forced organ donor or as a non-consenting subject of a biomedical experiment, they're equal. You shouldn't use either of them.
Sure.
Thanks,
Thank you very much, Gary. One just last question, I think, before we end the program. What
Yeah.
are your views on basically, as you know, many Jains actually, not only, I mean, are the vegetarians, but many of them follow the strict Jain diet of not eating root vegetables. So what's your concept on ahimsa to kind of plant-based body beings? I know you talked about mobile 5 sense beings, but obviously what about kind of some ahimsa involved in kind of our day-to-day? We need to eat to sustain ourselves. And many Jains also don't eat underground root vegetables. So what are your kind of views on kind of ahimsa towards the plant-based beings?
I've never understood the arguments for why root vegetables. I mean, I've heard the arguments. I've not really understood them, and they've not really resonated with me about whether or not onions or potatoes involve more violence than other plants do. That's not entirely clear to me. I think plants are one-sensed organisms in Jain Dharma. So actually, that's yet another reason why we should be vegans, because actually if you're drinking milk, you're eating more plants, because it takes more plants to produce a gallon of milk than it does, say, to produce. You're eating fewer plants if you're drinking soy milk than if you're drinking cow's milk, because the cow's milk involves more plants. I think, what I find very bizarre is that I end up having this discussion about veganism with people who are so concerned about ahimsa that they will not eat potatoes or onions, but they will drink milk. This just bewilders me. It's like, I don't understand it, and I've tried very hard to understand it, and I don't understand it. Now, maybe it hasn't been explained to me properly, and maybe somebody will explain it to me, but in a way that I will understand it and appreciate it. But I don't understand how you can deny the violence of milk while you're concerned about the violence against potatoes and onions. That just doesn't make sense to me. I do think, however, one of the things I think is important, very important, is that we all ought to eat less than we eat, because overeating is a form of violence. And I try to eat no more than 2 meals a day, and I try when I'm really sort of being conscientious about it. I try to fast like actually 8 days a month. I oftentimes don't. I used to when I was I used to do that quite easily, but now I guess I'm getting older. Maybe I need to sort of become more rigorous again. But I used to try to fast 8 days a month. There are Jain prescriptions about when you fast and things. And then I try to do like ambi where where you don't eat seasoning and stuff. And because I think our attachment to food is problematic, and I think we all eat too much. And I think overeating is a form of violence, because not only are you eating plants which Jains or many Jains believe are ensouled, and because that's actually a very interesting. The whole thinking about plants is actually very interesting. That's my next area of research, is to try to understand what the thinking is really about plants, because it's actually far more complicated than I think we think it is. But it's also a problem because we're denying other people food, and so we shouldn't eat more than we need. And we should recognize that overeating is a form of violence, and we need to not do that. Thank you very much. And those of you who don't know about Preakshaw meditation, if you can learn it, it's terrific. I learned it. It's a terrific form of meditation, and they teach you, the Samnijis teach you that at the various JVB centers. You've got one in London. Learn how to do Preakshaw meditation. It's magnificent. It'll change your life.
For making the time to join us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been great. I enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Areham, 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 Arham, 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 Arham. Arham, Arham, Arham.